The letter arrived on a Thursday. I remember because I had just gotten home from my grandmother's funeral, still wearing the black dress that kept sticking to the back of my legs, and the envelope was sitting on my kitchen counter, like it had been waiting for me. My aunt had slipped it into my bag at the reception without saying a word, just pressed it into my hands, squeezed my fingers once, and looked away. I didn't open it until nearly midnight, after I'd cried myself dry and eaten half a sleeve of crackers standing over the sink. And when I finally unfolded the 2 pages inside, when I read what my grandmother had written in her careful, slanted cursive, my entire life rearranged itself around a truth that had been buried for 30 years. But to explain that, I need to go back. I grew up in a house where love was distributed carefully, like it was a limited resource that had to be rationed. My mother, Diane, was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, the kind where you notice it first and understand it later. She had this particular talent for making every room feel like it revolved around her, and most people let it. My stepfather, Robert, was quieter. He had kind eyes and the habit of humming to himself when he cooked dinner, and he tried. He really did try with me. But there was always something slightly apologetic about the way he looked at me, like he was sorry for something he couldn't name. And I was 17 before I understood what that something was. My mother told me my biological father had died when I was 2. A car accident on Route 9 in early December. Black ice, nobody's fault. She kept one photograph of him on the bookshelf in the hallway, a grainy, underexposed thing that showed a man I could barely make out, dark hair, a plaid shirt, turned slightly to the side. She didn't talk about him much. When I asked, she'd get this faraway look and say something like, "He would have loved you so much," and then change the subject. I stopped asking around the time I started middle school because the asking always seemed to cause her a particular kind of pain that I felt responsible for. What I knew about my father, or thought I knew, his name was Thomas. He was 24 when he died. He and my mother had been together for 2 years. He had no family to speak of, an only child, parents both deceased by the time he and my mother met. There was no grave to visit, no relatives who remembered him, no trail of evidence that he had ever existed beyond that one blurry photograph and my mother's carefully curated grief. I accepted this version of my life the way children accept the stories they're given. You don't question the architecture of your own childhood while you're still living inside it. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Eleanor, was a small, precise woman who smelled like talcum powder and kept her house at 68 degrees year-round, regardless of the season. She and I had a particular kind of closeness that bypassed my mother entirely. When I was a kid, she'd let me help her in the garden, and she'd tell me things, small things, stories about her own childhood, observations about people, little fragments of wisdom she delivered without fanfare. She never talked down to me. Even when I was 7 or 8, she treated me like someone whose thoughts were worth taking seriously. She and my mother had a complicated relationship. I didn't fully understand it as a child, but I felt it, the tension that existed between them in every room they shared. My mother would get sharp and brittle around her own mother in a way she wasn't around anyone else. Eleanor would go quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who had made a decision not to say it. I thought for years it was just the ordinary friction between generations. Now I know it was guilt. Eleanor knew what my mother had done. She had known for 30 years, and she had stayed silent. until she couldn't anymore. Eleanor was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of my 29th year. By the time they caught it, it had already spread. She lived another 14 months after the diagnosis, and I spent as much of that time with her as I could manage, driving up to see her on weekends, sitting with her in the sunroom while she did crossword puzzles and I pretended to read. She didn't talk about dying, not directly. What she talked about was the past, her own parents, her marriage, things she regretted, choices she wished she'd made differently. I thought she was just doing the normal accounting that people do when they know the end is coming. I didn't understand she was building toward something. The last time I saw her conscious was 2 weeks before she died. She was in the hospital by then, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and something floral that someone had sprayed to cover it. She held my hand and looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Maggie, there is something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was afraid of what it would cost, and I was wrong to be afraid of that. You deserved the truth. You always deserved the truth." I thought she was going to tell me something about her life, about her marriage to my grandfather, or something from her past. I said, "Grandma, you don't have to." "I do," she said. "I do have to. I have to before I can go." She looked exhausted, but there was something clear and deliberate in her eyes. I wrote it all down. "Your Aunt Linda has the letter. I need you to promise me you'll read it." I promised. She died 11 days later. My mother flew in from Scottsdale, where she and Robert had retired 3 years earlier. She swept into the funeral with the quiet authority of a woman who had rehearsed grief her whole life. She hugged me in the parking lot, held me for exactly the right amount of time, said exactly the right things. And at the reception afterward, my Aunt Linda waited until my mother was on the other side of the room and pressed that envelope into my hands. I read the letter, standing at my kitchen counter at midnight, and my life fell apart and reassembled itself in the space of about 20 minutes. My grandmother's handwriting was careful and steady, the way she was. She started by apologizing. Not the performative apology of someone who wants to be absolved, but the real kind, the kind that costs something. She wrote, "I am sorry I waited so long. I told myself I was protecting you. That was partly true. But I was also protecting myself, and that part I am not proud of." Then she told me the truth. My father was not dead. His name was not Thomas. His name was David Calloway, and he was very much alive. He was a businessman, the kind of man who had started with very little and built something substantial over 30 years. A chain of regional hardware stores that had eventually been bought out by a larger company for enough money that the word significant didn't begin to cover it. He had a house in Vermont. He had remarried. He had 2 sons, both in their 20s. And he had spent the last 30 years believing that the daughter he'd fathered with a woman named Diane Marsh had been given up for adoption. My mother had told him that. She had told him she was pregnant, and that she had decided to give the baby up, and that she wanted no further contact. She told him this before I was born. He had tried to fight it. My grandmother's letter included details. She had witnessed some of it, had been there for conversations between my mother and David that turned ugly, that turned legal. He had hired a lawyer. My mother had countered with her own. And then, according to my grandmother, something shifted. David backed down. He disappeared from the picture. And I was born 3 months later. And my mother raised me as a single parent and eventually married Robert. And the story she told was the one I grew up with. What my grandmother didn't fully explain in the letter, what she said she didn't know all the details of, was why David had stopped fighting. She said she suspected, but she couldn't prove it. What she did know was this. My grandmother's own mother, my great-grandmother Ruth, had died when I was just under a year old. Ruth had been wealthy. She had left her estate, which included a house and a significant amount of money, to be divided between Eleanor and her other daughter, my great-aunt Patricia. But there had been a codicil, a provision in the will that made my mother the beneficiary of a separate trust, one set up specifically for Diane's children, on the condition that any such child be raised within the family. My grandmother believed, and had believed for decades, that my mother had used this trust to manipulate David, that she had somehow leveraged it, made him an offer, or threatened some legal complication that made him walk away, that she had chosen to claim the inheritance over acknowledging his rights as a father, that she had erased him completely, told me he was dead, constructed an entire fictional history, because acknowledging his existence might have complicated her claim to money that was meant for her children. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I set down the letter and stood very still in my kitchen for what felt like a long time. My whole life I had thought my father was dead. I had grieved him in the abstract way you grieve someone you never really knew, a kind of dull, permanent ache rather than acute loss. I had looked at that photograph and tried to find myself in the turned, blurry features of a stranger. I had absorbed my mother's careful sadness and made it part of my own emotional landscape. And none of it was real. None of it had ever been real. He was alive. He had 2 sons. He was in Vermont. The first thing I felt, if I'm being honest, was not anger. It was something colder and stranger than anger. It was the specific vertigo of realizing that the ground you've been standing on your entire life is not solid. That the story you were told is not just incomplete, but constructed. That someone who was supposed to love you made a deliberate decision to keep you from a truth that belonged to you. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table and read the letter again and again until the words stopped having quite so much charge, until I could hold them at a slight distance and think about what they actually meant. My grandmother had given me a name, David Calloway. She had given me what she knew of his location, Vermont, she said, outside of Burlington, she believed. She had given me the name of the trust attorney who had handled her mother's estate, a man named Gerald Finch, who was almost certainly retired or deceased by now, but whose firm might still have records. She had also given me something else. At the end of the letter, in a paragraph that was shorter and more deliberate than the rest, she wrote, "The trust is still active. There have been disbursements over the years, and your mother has been the administrator. I believe there is more money in it than she has told you. I believe she has been managing it in ways that benefit primarily herself. I cannot prove this. But I'm telling you because you deserve to know what questions to ask. I didn't know what that meant yet. I would find out. The weeks after the funeral were strange. I went through the motions of ordinary life. I work in human resources for a mid-sized tech company, the kind of job that requires a steady, diplomatic temperament, which which I have always had, which now struck me as possibly a survival mechanism developed in response to a childhood spent navigating my mother's moods. I returned calls, I filed reports, I went to the grocery store, and in the evenings and on weekends, I started digging. I want to be clear about something. I did not immediately confront my mother. This is the part of the story that I think surprises people most, because the version of events you'd see in a movie would have me calling her the morning after I read the letter, demanding answers, screaming, crying. But I had spent 29 years learning how my mother operated. I knew what confronting her before I had all the facts would look like. She would deny everything. She would cry. She would make herself the victim of my accusations. She would call Robert and have him talk to me about being reasonable. She would find a way to make me doubt my grandmother's account because Eleanor was gone and couldn't defend herself, and my mother has always been very good at making the absent party sound unreliable. So I waited. I gathered. I was methodical in a way that surprised even me. The first thing I did was look up David Calloway. It didn't take long. He was findable, the way successful business people tend to be findable in the age of the internet. The sale of his hardware store chain had generated local news coverage in Vermont 5 or 6 years earlier. There were a few photographs. A tall man with grey at his temples, the kind of face that had probably been handsome in his 20s and had aged into something more interesting. He had a LinkedIn profile. He had a company website for a small consulting firm he'd started after the sale. His name was exactly what my grandmother had written. I stared at his photograph for a long time. I was looking for myself in his face, the way I had looked for myself in that blurry photograph on my mother's bookshelf. And this time, I found things. Something in the set of the jaw, the way the eyes were spaced. I had always been told I looked like my mother, and I do, somewhat. But I had also always had this one quality that nobody in our family seemed to share. A particular expression, a kind of stillness, a way of holding my face when I was thinking. I could see it in David Calloway's photograph. I could see it clearly. I did not contact him yet. I needed more information first. The second thing I did was call Gerald Finch's old firm. The man himself had retired, but the firm was still operating, absorbed into a larger law practice. And when I explained that I was a beneficiary of the Ruth Harlow estate and was trying to understand the terms of a trust that had been established in the 1990s, they were cautious but not uncooperative. It took 3 calls and a formal written request and the production of my birth certificate, but eventually I was connected with an attorney named Karen Yee, who had access to the original documents. What she told me, carefully, precisely, in the way of someone who is navigating the boundary between what she legally could and could not share, was enough to confirm what my grandmother had suspected. The trust, established in 1994, had named Diane Marsh's children as beneficiaries, with Diane serving as trustee until the children reached the age of 25, at which point the trust was to be reviewed. I was 29. The review had not happened. I had never been informed of the trust's existence. Karen Yi chose her words very carefully. She said things like, "Typically in these situations," and "it would be standard practice too," and "I can only speak to the documents as written." But what she was telling me, in the coded language of someone who knew she was standing at the edge of something significant, was that I had never received what I was legally entitled to receive. That the trust had continued past my 25th birthday without the required review. That there were questions about the disbursements. I asked her if she could put me in touch with a trust litigation attorney. She gave me a name. The third thing I did was hire a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic. It felt dramatic. But I had a mother who was capable of extraordinary deception, and I was not willing to go into any confrontation with incomplete information. The investigator's name was Frank Hartley, and he was a quiet, middle-aged man who operated out of an office above a dry cleaner in my city. He had a direct manner that I appreciated. When I explained what I was looking for, financial records, any documentation of transactions related to the trust, any paper trail that might tell me what had been done with the money, he nodded like I was describing something entirely ordinary. "How long do you need?" I asked. "Depends what there is to find," he said. "Could be 2 weeks, could be 6. It took 8. While Frank was working, I told no one what I was doing. Not my friends, not my colleague Jamie, who I'm closest to at work. Nobody. The thing about discovering a betrayal this large is that you can't talk about it casually. It's too enormous. It reshapes too much context. And the second you say it out loud to someone, the dynamic shifts and you lose control of the narrative. I had spent my whole life having other people control my narrative. I was done with that. I went to see a therapist during this period. She was a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, who had been recommended to me by my GP and who had an office full of plants in a manner that was simultaneously warm and exactly matter-of-fact enough that I could talk to her without feeling like she was managing me. I did not tell her all the specifics. I kept the legal stuff compartmentalized, but I talked about the experience of discovering that a foundational truth of your life is a lie, about what it does to your sense of reality, about the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you had, but from learning that something you thought you had was never there. "What are you most angry about?" she asked me one day. I thought about it for a while. That she thought it was her right, I finally said. That she thought this was a decision she got to make. About my father. About me. About who I was allowed to know I was. Dr. Holt nodded slowly. "And what do you want to happen?" "I want her to have to look at what she did," I said. "Not privately, not where she can manage the reaction. I want there to be witnesses." There was a beat. Then Dr. Holt said, very carefully, "That's an understandable feeling. And it might be worth thinking about what you want after that. What the long-term version of this looks like." I knew what the long-term version looked like. I had known for a while. Frank Hartley came back to me in late October with a folder of documents that was thicker than I had expected. He walked me through them methodically. The trust had received disbursements from the original estate. There had been investment activity. There were records of withdrawals, some of which were documented as administrative fees, some of which were less clearly documented. The total in the trust, as of the most recent statements he had been able to obtain, was considerably larger than my mother had ever mentioned, because my mother had never mentioned it at all. There had also been a significant withdrawal 18 months earlier, around the time my mother and Robert had purchased a second property in Arizona, a vacation condo in Sedona. "She paid for the Sedona place with trust money?" I said. Frank's expression was carefully neutral. "The timing is consistent with that. I can't prove causation. Your attorney will be able to work with this better than I can." I took the folder to Karen Yee's referral, an attorney named Marcus Webb, who handled trust litigation. He was a tall, unhurried man who read documents without expression and asked questions that were precise and methodical. After about an hour, he set down the folder and looked at me. "This is actionable," he said. "The failure to notify you of your interest at 25 is a breach of fiduciary duty. The withdrawals are concerning and will need to be audited. The commingling of trust assets with personal assets, which is what that Sedona purchase suggests, is a serious problem." "What are my options?" I asked. He told me. There were several, ranging from a demand letter to a full civil suit. He explained the timeline for each, the likelihood of various outcomes, the costs. I listened carefully. Then I asked him how long it would take to be prepared to file, if I chose to go that route. 6 to 8 weeks, he said, if you can give me everything you have. "I can give you everything I have," I said. I had one more thing to do before any of that could happen. I needed to decide about David Calloway. I had been thinking about this for weeks, months, really, from the night I read the letter. My grandmother had given me his name. She had trusted me with this information, and they knew, sitting with it, that they had a choice about what to do. I could pursue the legal matter with my mother and leave David Calloway entirely out of it. He was a separate question, a separate wound, something I could decide about on my own timeline. Or I could reach out to him. Or I could do both. I thought about what it would mean for him. He had spent 30 years believing his daughter had been adopted, was gone, was someone else's story entirely. He had built a life, a marriage, 2 sons, a career. Reaching out to him would destabilize all of that. I didn't know how he would react. I didn't know if he wanted to be found. I didn't know if his wife knew. I didn't know if his sons knew. I was about to introduce a massive disruption into a life I knew almost nothing about, and I had to decide whether that was something I had the right to do. In the end, what I came back to was this. My grandmother had spent 30 years knowing the truth and staying silent because she was afraid. And the silence had cost me my father and cost him his daughter for 30 years. Whatever disruption my reaching out might cause, the alternative, remaining silent for another 30 years, or forever, seemed worse. He deserved to know too. He deserved to know that his daughter was not somewhere in the world being raised by strangers. He deserved to know what had actually happened. I wrote him a letter. On paper, by hand, because it seemed like something that needed to be done that way. I wrote 3 drafts. The final one was 3 paragraphs. I told him who I was. I told him that my grandmother had recently passed and left me information I needed to share with him. I said I wasn't sure what he knew or what he would want, but that I believed he deserved to have the information. I included my phone number and my email address and said that if he wanted to be in contact, I would welcome it, and that if he didn't, I would respect that. I mailed it on a Tuesday in early November. He called on a Friday. I was at work, at my desk, when my phone lit up with a Vermont area code. I stared at it for 2 full rings before I picked up. My hand was not entirely steady. "Is this Margaret Marsh?" he said. His voice was lower than I had expected. Careful. "Yes," I said. "It is." There was a long pause. "I got your letter," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what to say. I've been carrying this since Tuesday, and I couldn't..." He stopped. I could hear him gathering himself. "I need to know what happened," he said. "Can you tell me what happened?" I told him. Standing out in the hallway outside my office, leaning against the wall, speaking quietly, I told him the outline of what my grandmother had written. I told him about the trust. I told him about what my mother had said, that I was dead to her, that I'd been given up. There was a long silence when I finished. "She told me," he said slowly. "She told me you'd been placed with a family in Ohio, that they'd already taken you, that it was done." His voice broke slightly and then steadied. "I tried to fight it. I had a lawyer, and there were documents. And then my lawyer said there was a trust provision that would be legally complicated, and that, given the circumstances..." He stopped again. I was 25 years old. I didn't have much money then. My lawyer told me it could drag on for years and cost more than I had. And I thought you were already placed. I thought it was already done. I thought..." "I know," I said. "I know." She made sure it looked like there was no path forward. Another silence. Then, "You're sure? The DNA?" "I don't have one yet," I said. "I haven't done that yet." But my grandmother's letter was very specific, and she had no reason to. I paused. "Would you want one?" "No," he said immediately. "No. I looked at your letter and I could just..." He exhaled. "You have a way of writing that one of my boys has. This particular way of..." "It doesn't matter. I don't need a test. But I'll do one if you want it." "I'll do one," I said. "I think we should, for the legal stuff, if nothing else. But I believe you, and I believed it before you called." We talked for 40 minutes that first time. It was one of the stranger conversations of my life, this careful, cautious negotiation of emotion and information between 2 strangers who were not strangers. He told me about his life. His wife's name was Christine. His sons were Ryan and Ben, 24 and 22. He asked me about my life, tentatively, like he wasn't sure how much he was allowed to ask. I told him about my job, where I lived, a few small things. It felt like being on a first date with someone you already know you're going to love. the awkwardness masking something that was already inevitable. Before we got off the phone, he said, "What are you planning to do about your mother?" "I have an attorney," I said. "There's going to be legal action. I want you to know about it before it happens." He was quiet for a moment. "She did this to both of us," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "She did." "Okay," he said. "Okay. I'll support you in whatever you need. If there's testimony or documentation from my end, what the lawyers said back then, the conversations I had with Diane, I kept some of it. I kept some notes and letters because I thought I might need them someday. I had not expected that. I held the phone and felt something loosen in my chest. "You kept them?" "I kept them," he said. "I never really believed she just disappeared. A person doesn't just..." He stopped. "I'll send you copies of everything I have." I stood in the hallway for another few minutes after we hung up, looking at the fire exit sign and trying to process what had just happened. Then I went back to my desk and sat down and stared at my computer screen for a while without actually seeing it. I had a father. I had brothers. I had a father who had tried to fight for me 29 years ago and had kept the documentation of it all this time. And I had a mother who had taken all of that from both of us. My mother called me in December to talk about Christmas. She wanted to know if I was coming to Scottsdale. She and Robert had a new place out there, the property in Arizona, the one Frank Hartley had connected to the trust withdrawal. And she'd been talking about hosting for the holidays. Her voice was warm and normal, the voice of a woman who had no idea that anything had changed. I told her I wasn't sure about my plans yet. She said she hoped I'd come. She said she missed me. After I hung up, I sat very still for a while. The part of me that had loved her my whole life was still there. That's the thing nobody prepares you for. The love doesn't evaporate when you discover what someone has done. It complicates. It becomes something else. But it's still there, underneath everything. And that's almost the worst part. I did not go to Scottsdale for Christmas. What I did instead was go to Vermont. David and Christine had invited me to come for the holidays. I had hesitated. It was fast, it was a lot, and I wasn't sure I was ready. But something in me knew that if I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, I would unravel in ways I couldn't afford to right then. So I drove up on the 23rd. David's house was a farmhouse outside of Burlington, the kind of old New England place with wide plank floors and windows that rattled slightly when the wind came up. Christine met me at the door. She was a compact woman with grey streaked hair and eyes that looked at me directly, and she hugged me immediately, which I hadn't expected. "We're so glad you're here," she said. And it was the kind of thing people say that usually means nothing, but in this case felt completely true. Ryan and Ben were both home. They were tall and brown-haired and looked like their father, and also slightly like me. Ben, the younger one, spent the first 20 minutes circling me slightly warily before eventually sitting next to me at the kitchen table and asking about my job in the forthright way of someone who has decided that the only way forward is direct. Ryan shook my hand and said, "This is a lot, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it really is." He nodded. "For us too," he said. "But, like, in a good way? I don't know. Is it okay to say that?" "It's okay to say that," I said. We had dinner. We sat around a large table and passed dishes and talked about things that were both ordinary and not ordinary at all. And at some point, David told a story about something that had happened in his hardware store 30 years ago that made everyone laugh. And I laughed too, genuinely. And I thought, I could have had this. I could have had all of this. That thought hit me harder than I expected. Not with anger. The anger came later. But with a kind of clean, specific grief. I was 30 years old. I had grown up without a father, in a house where love was managed and rationed, in a story that was built on a lie. And these people had been here all along, having dinners like this, not knowing I existed. On Christmas morning, David gave me something. He came into the kitchen where I was making coffee and set a manila envelope on the counter. "The letters and notes I told you about," he said, "from back then. I made copies for your attorney. I thought you should see the originals first." I looked at the envelope. "You really kept these?" "I couldn't get rid of them," he said. "I always thought, I know this sounds..." He stopped. "I always thought that someday there would be a reason I was glad I kept them." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were letters between his attorney and my mother's attorney from 1995 and 1996. There were notes in David's own handwriting from phone calls he'd had with various people. There was a letter from my mother, one that his attorney had received and copied, that was direct and cold in a way I recognized. "I have made my decision regarding the child," it read. "Mr. Calloway has no legal standing. Any further attempts at contact will be addressed through the courts." There was something about a trust provision. There was something that was not quite a threat and not quite not a threat about the resources available to our family if this were to become protracted. I read it twice. Then I looked at David. "She used the trust to leverage this," I said. He nodded slowly. "That's what my attorney said at the time, that the family had money and resources and time, and that for me to fight it was going to cost more than I had." His jaw was tight. "I thought about you every birthday," he said. "Every year. I thought about where you might be, what your name might be, whether you were okay." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "My birthday is March 14th. Something crossed his face. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there." The legal process started in January. Marcus Webb filed the demand letter first, which gave my mother 30 days to respond. The demand laid out the breaches clearly. The failure to notify me of my trust interest at 25, the unaudited withdrawals, the potential commingling of trust assets with personal funds. It requested a full accounting of the trust and the return of any improperly disbursed funds. My mother called me the day after the letter was delivered. I had been expecting the call. I let it go to voicemail, listened to the message, which started out controlled and quickly became less so, and then called Marcus Webb to let him know it had been received. She called again the next day, and the day after. The third message dropped the control tone entirely. She said I was being ridiculous. She said I had no idea what I was talking about. She said that my grandmother had always been difficult, and that whatever Eleanor had told me was colored by decades of resentment toward my mother. She said that the trust had been managed entirely properly, and that she had done everything right, and that if I would just talk to her, we could sort this out like adults. I did not call her back. Not yet. Robert called me 2 days later. Robert, who had always been the soft-spoken counterweight to my mother's intensity. He said, "Maggie, I don't know everything that's going on, but I know your mom is very upset, and I think it would help everyone if you two could just talk." I said, "Robert, I want you to know that I don't have any anger toward you, but there are things happening right now that have to go through attorneys, and I'm not able to discuss them with her directly." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it the money stuff?" "Among other things," I said. Another pause. "Is it also about..." He stopped. "Is it about who your father is?" That caught me completely off guard. I was silent for a moment. "You knew?" I said. "I've known since before we got married," he said. "She told me. She said it was complicated and that you were better off not knowing and that it was finished." The slow, cold weight of that settled over me. Robert had known. Robert had looked at me my whole childhood, had spent 20-odd years being my stepfather, and had known that my father was alive and had said nothing. "I'm sorry," he said. I don't know what I should have done, but I should have done something." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I hung up, sat with that for a while, added it to the pile of things I was carrying. My mother retained an attorney of her own. The response to Marcus Webb's demand letter was dismissive. The trust had been properly managed. My mother had broad discretionary authority under the trust document. Any disbursements were within her rights as trustee, and my demands were legally baseless. Her attorney was aggressive in tone, in a way that Marcus read as a tell. "This is defensive posturing," he said. "If they had a clean position, they wouldn't need to be this aggressive." The discovery process began. This is the part of legal proceedings that most people don't see in movies. The slow, grinding accumulation of documents and depositions and requests for production that makes up most of civil litigation. It is not dramatic. It is tedious and expensive and requires the kind of sustained focus that is easier when you have righteous anger to sustain it, which I did. What the discovery process revealed over the course of several months was worse than what I had initially suspected. The trust, which had been established with approximately $300,000 in 1994, had grown over the years. Prudently invested, it had performed reasonably well. The total value at the time of the required review, my 25th birthday, should have been in the neighborhood of $600,000. What was actually in the trust when the audit began was approximately $340,000. The difference, roughly $260,000, had been disbursed over the previous 4 years. The documentation on many of these disbursements was thin. The Sedona property, the remodel on the Scottsdale house, a European vacation, a new car for Robert. These things appeared when cross-referenced with trust withdrawal dates and amounts to tell a story. My attorney was careful not to overstate things to me. "We can establish the withdrawals," he said. "We can demonstrate that the documentation for many of them is inadequate. Whether a court will characterize this as a breach of fiduciary duty or fraud is a question of how good we are at telling the story and how good their attorney is at countering it." "How good are we at telling the story?" I asked. He almost smiled. "Better than them," he said. The deposition of my mother happened on a Tuesday in March, 8 months after I'd read my grandmother's letter. I was there, sitting with Marcus Webb, when she came in with her attorney. She looked the way she always looked, composed, impeccably put together, the kind of woman who would wear a good blazer to her own funeral and look right for it. She glanced at me once, briefly, and what crossed her face in that half-second was something I catalogued carefully. It was not guilt. It was not remorse. It was something closer to annoyance. The annoyance of a woman who has managed a situation competently for 30 years and cannot understand why it is now becoming unmanageable. Marcus deposited her for 3 hours. I watched. She was a skilled witness, careful with her language, deflecting when deflection was possible, never volunteering more than she had to. But Marcus was patient and meticulous, and there were several moments when her answers contradicted documents and evidence, and in those moments, the annoyance she carried shifted into something more controlled, something colder. At one point, Marcus asked her directly, "Did you tell David Calloway that his daughter had been placed for adoption?" Her attorney objected. Marcus rephrased. Eventually she answered, "The situation with David Calloway was complex, and I made decisions that I believed were in the best interest of my daughter." "Did you tell him she had been placed for adoption?" Marcus asked again. A pause. "I communicated to him that I intended for her to have a stable family situation and that his involvement was not part of that plan." "That's not what I asked," Marcus said pleasantly. "I asked if you told him his daughter had been placed for adoption." Silence. "Miss Marsh," her attorney prompted. "I may have communicated something along those lines," she said finally, "given the circumstances." I kept my expression completely even. Marcus moved on to the next question. But I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not yet, but a kind of solidity. She had said it. It was on record. 3 days after the deposition, my mother's attorney reached out to Marcus about a settlement. The number they offered was considerably less than the full amount in question. Marcus counteroffered. There were 2 rounds of negotiation. My mother's attorney eventually came back with a number that was within range of what Marcus had advised me was reasonable, given the cost and risk of going to trial. I asked Marcus what he recommended. He laid out the math clearly. The probability of winning at trial, the potential recovery, minus the costs of litigation, versus the certainty of the settlement number. He was not pushing me in either direction. He was giving me information. "I don't want to settle," I said. He looked at me. "That's a valid choice," he said carefully. "Is that because of the money or because of something else?" "Both," I said, "but mostly something else." What the something else was, my mother had, in her deposition, admitted to a version of what she had done to David Calloway. But the deposition was not public. The settlement would have a confidentiality clause. If I settled, My mother's version of events would remain private. She would write the check and move on. And the story she had told for 30 years would simply conclude quietly, without anyone who knew her ever understanding what she had actually done. I needed witnesses. There was a family event coming up. My mother's side of the family had an annual reunion, a July 4th gathering at my Aunt Linda's house in Connecticut that had been happening for as long as I could remember. It was a kind of event where everyone was present. My mother and Robert, my Aunt Linda and her husband, my cousins and their families, some older relatives who came in from various states. Everyone who had known me my whole life. Everyone who had believed the same story I had believed. I called my Aunt Linda. Linda was the one who had pressed the envelope into my hands at the funeral. She was the one my grandmother had chosen to hold the letter. She already knew some of what had happened. I had told her the broad strokes several months earlier, and she had been the one to say, quietly, I suspected something wasn't right. I never knew what. I told her now that I wanted to come to the 4th of July gathering. She was quiet for a moment and then said, Your mother will be here. I know, I said. That's why I want to come. Another silence. Then, Okay, she said. I'll make sure you have space to say what you need to say. I also called David. I asked him if he would be willing to come. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You want me there. I think you should be, I said. It's your story too. Another silence. Longer this time. Okay, he said. Tell me when and where. I spent the weeks before July 4th preparing, not in a dramatic way, not rehearsing speeches or planning confrontations, but I organized the documentation. I talked to Marcus about the limits of what I could say publicly without jeopardizing the legal case. I talked to Dr. Holt about what I was trying to accomplish. Is it justice? She asked. Or is it something else? It's both, I said. I want her to have to stand in front of the people she respects and have them know what she did. I want there to be a record. And I want to stop carrying this secret like it's mine to carry. It was never mine. Dr. Holt nodded. And afterward? What does it feel like in the version where this goes the way you want it to? I thought about it. Like I can put something down, I said. Like I don't have to keep holding it. The 4th of July was sunny and loud in the way that those gatherings always are. Kids running around the backyard, somebody's playlist going on the patio, the smell of charcoal and someone's sunscreen. My Aunt Linda's house was a colonial with a big backyard that had been the site of the same party for 20-some years. I arrived early, before my mother and Robert. David arrived shortly after me. Linda introduced him to the few relatives who were already there, carefully, as an old friend of the family who had some connection to the occasion. The strangeness of his presence registered on some faces and was filed away. My mother and Robert arrived around 2 o'clock. She came through the back gate in white linen pants and a blue top, sunglasses pushed up on her head, the picture of an elegant summer afternoon. She saw me first and smiled, warm, seamless, the professional-grade smile of a woman who has decided that everything is still fine. She hugged me. I let her. She had not noticed David yet. He was standing across the patio, talking quietly with my cousin Mark, his back slightly turned. Robert saw me and gave me a careful look. He knew something was coming. He had known since our phone call. He made a small gesture with his hand. I couldn't read it exactly, but it felt like either a warning or an apology, or both. There was about an hour of ordinary gathering, food, drinks, the normal circling and clustering of family. I stayed present and calm. I talked to people. I watched my mother work the room with her usual ease and felt, watching her, something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but some compound of the two. Then David turned around, and my mother saw him. I was watching her face when it happened. I was positioned for exactly this reason. What I saw was not recognition. It was something before recognition, some animal-level alarm that went off in her body before her brain had even finished processing the information. She went very still. Then the stillness ended, and something crossed her face that I had never seen before in 30 years of knowing her. It was fear. Plain, unmistakable fear. David walked towards her. He moved steadily and without aggression. He looked at her with an expression I can only describe as very tired and very resolved. My Aunt Linda was nearby, my cousin Mark, several other relatives who had filtered closer without knowing entirely why, just sensing that something was happening. "Hello, Diane," David said. My mother's face had reorganized itself into something controlled, but the control was visible as a performance now, in a way it usually wasn't. "David," she said. Her voice was even. "This is a surprise." "I imagine it is," he said. I stepped forward. This was the moment. I had rehearsed very little of this, because I had learned that rehearsed things sound rehearsed, and what I wanted was to simply say the truth plainly, in front of witnesses. So I said it plainly. "Mom," I said, "I need you to meet someone properly." I paused. "This is David Calloway. He's my father." The silence that followed had a particular quality. The kind of silence where you can feel everyone in a space recalibrating at once. Mark's head turned. Linda stood very still. Robert, on the edge of the patio, looked down at the ground. My mother looked at me. "Maggie?" "My grandmother wrote me a letter before she died," I said. "She told me the truth. She told me about the adoption story you told David, about the trust, about what you used to make him go away." "You're misrepresenting what happened," my mother said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something effortful. "There's a lot of context you don't have." "Then explain the context," I said, "to all of us, right now." She looked around at the relatives who had gathered, at Linda, at Mark, at cousins she had known for decades. The calculation in her eyes was visible. She was assessing who she could manage, how much damage she could control, what story she could deploy in the next 60 seconds. I watched her do it. And I watched the moment she understood that the math didn't work. There were too many people. David was standing right there. I had the letter, the legal proceedings, the deposition. There was no story that worked. David had no legal rights, she said finally. I made a decision about my daughter's upbringing, and I stand by it. You told him she was given up for adoption, David said quietly. She wasn't. She was right here. She was 30 feet away, and you told me she was placed in Ohio. A sound from Linda. Not a word, just a sharp exhale. And you took money from a trust that was meant for me, I said. Money that was meant for your children. You took it for yourself, and you didn't tell me that trust existed. I managed that trust. For yourself, I said. The Sedona condo, the renovation, the car. There's a full audit now. My attorney has everything. She went silent. I'm not doing this to hurt you, I said. And I meant that. I meant it the way you can mean something and also know that the thing you're doing is going to hurt someone anyway. I'm doing this because I spent 30 years in a story that wasn't true. And the people I love, the people here, have been in that story too. They deserved to know, and so did he. I looked at David when I said that last part. He held my gaze. My mother said nothing. It was the first time in my life, in 30 years, that I had seen her have nothing to say. She looked at Linda. Linda looked back at her, and the look was not warm. She looked at Robert. Robert's face was doing something complicated that I didn't have the bandwidth to fully interpret in that moment. Then she turned and walked back through the gate. Robert followed, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that he was not following willingly. Nobody said anything for about 30 seconds. Then Mark said quietly, "Holy shit," which honestly was exactly the right response. Linda came to stand next to me. She took my hand and squeezed it once. The same gesture she had made at the funeral when she pressed the envelope into my bag. Then she let go and went to David and introduced herself properly. I stood in the middle of the patio and felt something I was not entirely prepared for. Not triumph. It wasn't triumph. Not relief exactly, though there was some of that. What I felt was large and difficult to name, like something that had been pressing on me from the inside had finally been allowed to be outside, in the air, where it could be seen. Like I could breathe slightly deeper than I had in months. David found me a few minutes later. He stood beside me for a moment without saying anything. Then, "You okay?" "No," I said. "But I think I will be." He nodded. "That's usually the best you can do." The settlement negotiation resumed after the 4th of July, but the dynamic had shifted. My mother's attorney, who had been aggressive and dismissive in the earlier rounds, was notably less so. The new number they put on the table was closer to what Marcus had advised me to hold out for. There was still negotiation. There is always negotiation. But the conclusion felt different now. Like the outcome was moving in the right direction, not because of a legal victory, but because of something having been named correctly. We reached a settlement in September. The confidentiality clause that had been in the original offer was gone. I had refused it. The amount represented the full extent of the calculated breach, minus legal costs. My mother signed it without ever calling me directly. Her attorney communicated with Marcus. The document was executed and filed. That was the money, the legal thing, the clean, provable version of what had happened. The other thing, the harder thing, took longer. My mother did not call me after the 4th of July gathering. For 6 weeks she didn't call. Robert sent me a text that said simply, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I believe you. I don't know exactly what the right thing is from here, but I'm sorry." I texted back, "Thank you. I meant it." When my mother finally called, it was a Wednesday evening in August. I let it ring. Then I called her back the next morning because I had decided that I would take the call when I was ready to take it, not when it was convenient for her. She started with things I hadn't expected. There was something almost humble in the first few minutes. She said she knew she had done wrong. She said she had been young and afraid, and she had made choices she couldn't undo. She said she hoped I could understand that she had believed at the time that she was doing what was best for me. I waited until she finished. Then I said, "You might have believed that, but you also did it because of the trust, because acknowledging David would have complicated your control of the money, and you know that." Silence. "I'm not going to tell you who you are or what your reasons were," I said. "You know your reasons. What I can tell you is what it cost. It cost me a father for 30 years. It cost David his daughter. It cost me the truth about who I am. And it cost me the ability to trust you. And I don't know if I can get that back. Maggie, I'm not saying never," I said. "I'm not telling you we have no future. But right now, today, I need distance. I need you to not call me for a while and let me figure out who I am without the version of my life that you built." She cried. I sat with the sound of it and did not move toward her and did not say it would be okay, because I didn't know if it would be okay. Because some things are not okay, and pretending they are is just another kind of lie. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment. It was a Tuesday morning, early. The light was coming through the window at the angle that meant it was around 8 o'clock. I felt exhausted in a way that was different from how I'd been feeling for months. Not the grinding exhaustion of carrying a secret and building a case, but the clean exhaustion of having done something difficult and necessary. David and I had been talking regularly by then. We'd settled into a rhythm, a phone call every week or two, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter depending on what was happening. He had told Christine everything, and Christine had reached out to me separately, a warm and direct email that said, among other things, that she was glad I had found my way to them, and that the door was always open. Ryan had texted me a few times with things his dad had mentioned about me. Nothing heavy, just ordinary things, the kind of text you send to someone you're getting to know. Ben had asked if I wanted to come up for a weekend in September. Just a casual thing, hang out, see what it felt like. I did go up in September. It was quieter than Christmas. No holiday charge, no particular occasion. Just a weekend. I helped Christine in the garden on Saturday morning. I watched a football game with David and the boys Saturday afternoon, and learned that Ben was devoted to his team in a way that was slightly excessive and completely genuine. We went out to dinner Saturday evening, And at some point, someone made a joke I don't even remember, and all four of us were laughing. And I had that feeling again, the one I'd had at Christmas, the one that was grief and gratitude at the same time. After dinner, David and I sat on the porch for a while. It was cold enough that we were both wearing jackets, and there were stars, the kind you don't see in the city. We talked about a lot of things, about his business, about my work, about what the next year might look like. At some point he said, "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to." "Okay," I said. "How are you with all of it? Not the legal stuff, the rest of it." I thought about that for a while. "Some days I'm okay," I said. "Some days I'm not. I'm still figuring out who I am, I think, in this new version. It's like everything is mostly the same, but there's this completely different foundation under it." He nodded. "I'm still processing too," he said. "I look at you and I think about all the years." He stopped. "But I'm trying to not live in that, the missing years, because there's this one." He paused. "You're here now." "I'm here now," I agreed. We sat there for another few minutes without talking, just watching the dark and the stars. It was one of those silences that is full rather than empty. The DNA test, which we'd done in July as Marcus had recommended, had come back in early August. I had already known the answer, but seeing it in a percentage, the unambiguous, clinical language of paternity science, had done something. It had made it real in a different register. I had held the results and thought, this is who I am. This is the actual fact of me. And nobody's story can change this. In October, I went to therapy and told Dr. Holt that I thought I was starting to turn a corner. She asked me what that felt like. I said it felt like I was starting to want things again, instead of just managing things. It felt like the future was beginning to have some shape to it, rather than just being an undifferentiated space where I would continue to exist. "What do you want?" she asked. I had to think about it. "I want to know David better," I said. "I want to know my brothers. I want to figure out what my relationship with my mother can be, eventually, not soon, but eventually. I want to stop being defined by this, by what was done to me. I want this to be part of my story, but not the whole thing." She nodded. "That sounds healthy," she said. "I want to be happy," I said. "Just regular happy, the boring kind." She smiled. "That's a completely legitimate goal," she said. November came, a year since Eleanor's funeral, more or less. I drove out to the cemetery on a Saturday. Not the one in Connecticut where Eleanor was buried. That was too far for a day trip. But to the local cemetery where my grandfather was, because it was quiet there, and I wanted to sit somewhere that felt like memory. I thought about Eleanor, about the weight she had carried for 30 years, about what it costs to know a truth you're too afraid to tell. I understood it better now than I had when I first read the letter. Not the withholding. I still couldn't entirely forgive that, but the complexity of it. She had been afraid of what it would do to her daughter. She had been afraid of what it would do to me. She had made the wrong choice, and she had known it, and she had carried it until she couldn't anymore. And at the end, she had found the courage she hadn't been able to find before. I thought about my mother, about the anger I still had, which was real and not going anywhere soon, but also about the fact that she was 61 years old and had spent her entire adult life managing a lie, and that whatever satisfaction she had gotten from the control and the money, she was now standing in the wreckage of it. Her family knew. Her mother had known and had told me. Her husband had known and had apologized to me. The trust was gone. I was gone, at least for now. I didn't feel sorry for her, but I could see her a little. I could see the person who had been so afraid of something that she had built an elaborate structure of deception around it. And I could see that the structure was not strength. It never had been. I thought about David, about the 30 years he had spent wandering, about the letter he'd gotten from me in November, the one that had cracked open everything. About the Friday phone call when I'd heard his voice for the first time and had to press my palm against the wall to steady myself. About the porch in September and the stars. I thought about Ryan and Ben, about the text exchanges that had gotten less formal over the months, about the group chat we'd started, the three of us, that was mostly memes and occasional football commentary. I thought about what my life looked like now versus what it had looked like a year ago. Same job, same apartment, same city, same face in the mirror. And also completely different. A different foundation, like I'd said to David. Everything built on something real now. I drove home as the sun was going down, the November light going pink and thin across the highway. On impulse, I called David. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. I was at the cemetery, just thinking about things. "Eleanor?" he said. "Yeah," I said. And other things. "You okay?" I thought about it. "Yeah," I said. "Actually, yeah, I am." There was a comfortable beat. "Good," he said. "David," I said, "thank you for keeping the letters, for calling me back, for all of it." "Maggie," he said, "thank you for finding me." I hung up and drove the rest of the way home. The apartment was warm when I got back. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read my grandmother's letter a year ago, at midnight, with the crackers and the black dress, and the rearranging of everything I knew. I thought about what Eleanor had written at the very end, the last sentence of the letter, the one I had read a dozen times. "I hope you will find what should have always been yours." I had my father's voice in my phone. I had my brother's in a group chat. I had a settlement in a file cabinet. I had a new foundation under everything. I had found it. Not in a clean way, not without cost, but I had found it. I drank my tea and let myself be still. And for the first time in a long time, the stillness felt like peace instead of like waiting. The heirloom was still in the box somewhere in my mother's house. A ring that had been my great-grandmother Ruth's, that Eleanor had always said would come to me someday. I didn't know if I'd ever get it. There were a lot of things I didn't know yet. But I knew who I was. I knew where I came from. I knew who was on the other end of the phone. And that, I had learned, was the inheritance that actually mattered.